3,500 years ago when Joshua and Caleb pressed into the promised land. And we believe, and our hypothesis has always been, that when Joshua and Caleb went into the promised land and began to clear out the Nephilim tribes that were there, there was a diaspora. And that meant that these Nephilim tribes fled the area. They fled the area. Some went northward into Europe. Others perhaps built boats and went out the Mediterranean, perhaps the Red Sea, and populated the New World. What is interesting, what is absolutely fascinating, and we bring this in Watchers 10 and also the new book, Nephilim Hybrids, is the fact that the DNA evidence is pointing to a European ancestry. The DNA evidence so far is pointing to a European ancestry and also in the Middle East. And that bolsters our hypotheses that these elongated skulls, like I found out on Catalina Island and also that we found in Peru, may have actually originated in the Middle East and in Europe. And folks, that goes against the Darwinian paradigm.
And here to talk about those giants and their historical impact and also the mystery, if you will, of giant DNA is our good friend, L.A. Marzulli.
Great to be here, Gary. Thanks.
You are, as always, on the trail of something very mysterious. And on the table in front of you are a couple of your finds. We've spoken of these a bit in the past. Things have developed greatly. One of the things we'd really like to know, and we understand that there were giants. We believe it because the Bible teaches it. But who were they? Can you track them in history? Can you track them right up until modern history? That's the question.
What's interesting about being on the trail, and this is something I never would have imagined I'd be doing. We've been on it for basically 5 years. When I went out to Catalina Island, I went out there to search for archaeological pictures that were taken in 1919, 1921 by Ralph Glidden, who's been disparaged by the archaeological community. But what I found, which is, you can't dispute it in my opinion, were several pictures. We found 6-fingered skeletons. We found 2 skeletons that were just around 9 feet tall. We found elongated skulls, all pictures from 1919. And all that evidence that was there is completely gone. Those skeletons have vanished. And we had 3 people look at those skeletons or those pictures of the skeleton and basically extrapolate from Ralph Glidden's height. And you were instrumental in that, by the way, of 5'8", and we were able to extrapolate where the skeleton was in relation to the picture. So it's complex. There are giants in North America. Native American tribes discuss this, that these legends have been handed down for hundreds of years, from one Native American tribe to grandfather to grandson, and down it goes. In Paracas, we get something completely different. Paracas is in Peru. It's right on the ocean. It's a very beautiful spot, the Paracas Bay. But these elongated skulls are found in only really one place in that area, and that comes from the Chongos necropolis. That's where the Paracas royalty are buried. And what's fascinating about this, and I have to tip my hat first of all to Brian Forrester, who put this on the map for everyone, really. And the moment I saw this in 2013, we put an expedition together, and Richard Shaw, the director of the Watchers series, we went down. This became the nexus of Watchers 6. But what's incredible about this is it fits the timeline of the diaspora or the conquest of Canaan. These skulls, these entities, whatever they are, come into Paracas seemingly from nowhere around 3,500 years ago, roughly in that time period. And they vanished about 2,000 years ago. So they're there between 1,200 and 1,500 years, and they are different from the normal population. Now, it's taken us 5 years to get DNA results, because what we're trying to say is if they're indigenous, then the DNA should show that. If they are from the Middle East, then perhaps we'll see DNA evidence that will point to that. And that's what we're basically revealing with the book and the DVD.
Now, the scenario here is very interesting. Your tracking of DNA reveals a historical movement of these giants. That is to say, they seem to have originated in the Middle East or been powerful there, and then they were essentially the enemies of God. God instructed his people to move against them. His people were successful in that. And the giants seem to have migrated then. And your hypothesis is that they migrated into the Western world.
And I like the word that you use. Our hypothesis is exactly that. That as Joshua and Caleb were pressing the war, prosecuting the war to conquer the Promised Land, then some of these Nephilim tribes perhaps fled northward. Others built reed boats and maybe sailed out the Mediterranean. And while that sounds preposterous to many people, Thor Heyerdahl actually filmed this and did it. He built a reed boat. He put a sail and sailed out the delta, the Nile Delta, and without a compass or any map or anything else, just allowing the trade winds to blow him, he wound up on the island of Barbados, which is the New World. So he proved in modernity that this could be done in antiquity. And we find that absolutely astounding. But to me, what is amazing here is the DNA evidence. And we've now tested well over 30 samples. And I realize the naysayers will go, it's contamination. So at what point, how many samples do we need before we see something and we go, maybe it's not contamination, maybe it's something else? And we had permission from the Minister of Culture to do this. It took 4 years to get permission, but we got permission.
I want to go back a little bit at this point in time, and for our audience's sake, I'd like to just talk about the giants.
Sure.
As the Bible does, because essentially this is sort of an ignored portion of Scripture.
A fringe part of Scripture.
It's considered, on the fringe. You don't talk about the giants, but they play a part in history. Chapter 14 of Genesis talks about 4 Gentile kings, and I'm not going to mention their names, who come up against Abraham. Now, Abraham's in the Promised Land, and he and Lot have settled the Promised Land at this point. God is behind their efforts. He's blessing them. And in the verse 5, it says, in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him. Now, they came after Abraham with the idea of conquering the land. But here's the interesting part. And they smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shaveh Kiriataim. 3 tribes of giants are mentioned here. And the kings came into the land against Abraham and against the giants. And this is the first really prominent mention of giant tribes after Abraham and Lot came in and settled. But it's not the last.
Yeah.
They're mentioned many, many times.
And what's disturbing is that they're there to begin with.
Right.
That Abraham and the crew is actually dealing with these, whatever they are. That's what's disturbing.
Now let's move forward a bit to Numbers, chapter 13. And we have here at the end of Numbers chapter 13 a tribe mentioned. They're called the children of Anak, A-N-A-K. And the children of Anak are called the Anakim. They're giants. But the fascinating thing, and you mentioned this very often in your lectures, Anakim means long-necked ones, meaning that there's something about their anatomy that's weird. And their countenance is strange. So we have long-necked giants with I think really scary faces. And the episode here, and I'm going to give it back to you right after this. The episode here is the turning point in Israelite history. When Joshua and Caleb were given the opportunity to go in and defeat the Anakim, and they were willing to do it. But their compatriots said, no, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. There's no way we can fight these people. These are the long-necked ones that they refused to go up with. As a result, they are forced to wander 40 years in the wilderness. Now, this is a breaking point in Israelite history.
It is. And what amazes me, and I wrote about this little sidestep here in the Cosmic Chess Match, that the reason why, in my opinion, that God hardens Pharaoh's heart over and over and over again. Pharaoh goes, well, let him go. And then God hardens Pharaoh's heart, is to show the Israelites who he really is and what he's capable of doing, knowing full well that in the not too distant future, he's going to bring them all up to the Promised Land, and they're going to see what's there, and they're going to turn tail and run. And they do that. But that generation dies off. It's 40 years. A new generation comes up, and they go in and prosecute the war. And what we see is there's a supernatural element to the prosecution of that war.
Absolutely.
Think of Jericho.
Yeah.
That's absolutely astounding what happens to Jericho. And Jericho, to me, is a Nephilim stronghold. That's what it is.
And
So
the word got out, by the way, as Joshua began to win battles, one after another, that God is with this man.
Yes.
We cannot fight him. And they evacuated the land.
There's a diaspora. These tribes begin to evacuate the land. Some perhaps go north. Some build reed boats. Thor Heyerdahl, we talked about that. It's already been proven. And if that's the case, then should we find evidence of that? And as I stated, on Catalina Island, 9-foot giants. We've got the mounds, the enigmatic and mysterious mound builders all through the United States. And we've talked about that before right here on this program. Well, what we think are there, and you've already mentioned the Emims, the Zanzamim, the Nephilim, the Raphaim, the Anakim. They seem to be different tribes with different names, perhaps denoting different genetic characteristics. Now, that's conjecture on my part, but that's what it may be. Certainly, the Anakim needs long necks. That seems to be the dominant feature about whatever these entities are.
Well, and their names seem to connote physical characteristics, like the Zuzim and the Zamzumim. The Zamzumim is the Hebrew way of saying buzzing, as we'd use the word buzz.
What is that? Their language sounds like a buzzing?
Do they sound like they buzz when they talk, and so they were named the buzzing ones? Clearly, there's something strange going on here.
And in my opinion, and this is conjecture, but it goes back to Genesis 3:15, and certainly your talk a few years ago at the Nephilim Mounds Conference was incredible. It's all about the seed. If Genesis 3:15 says the seed of a serpent will be at war, at enmity with the seed of the woman, we know that from the seed of the woman comes Messiah, but the seed of the serpent erupts just a few chapters later in Genesis 6, and I think it happens over and over and over again, right up into modernity, where Jesus warns us it'll be like the days of Noah when the Son of Man returns. So if that's the case, and this seed war is erupting, then it solves the conundrum with many people who read the chapters of the conquest of Canaan and say, wow, this mandate from a loving, holy God doesn't seem so loving and holy, because the mandate is to wipe everybody out. Kill the men, women, children, kill the animals, and burn everything. That's genocidal, it's maniacal, it's capricious, it shows favoring of one race over another, unless we're looking at Genesis 3:15, the seed of a serpent has manifested in this area, and that's what we're looking at. That's the game changer. That changes everything, and that's why I tenaciously hold to that interpretation.
And I agree with you. In fact, the text strongly indicates these people are not human. They are deviants.
Something else.
Something other than human. And God continually asks the children of Israel, look, please wipe these people out. They are evil. They are wicked. And unless there was something really wrong with these people, I don't think God would commend.
Well, we have the proof text of Nineveh, where he sends Jonah in there to preach and give them a chance, and they do. And okay, so they repent, but this is something different.
Right.
This is something different. And I've come to call Nephilim and Nephilim tribes the soulless ones. I believe that only God can put a soul in a person. And we're not really sure how that works and what that is. But I think these entities are the soulless ones, and they are in a fixed state. No salvation because they're soulless.
And we're talking to L.A. Marzulli. I'm holding here a DVD and a book, Expert Analysis, DNA Results. We're going to get to that. The book and the DVD, in a moment I'll tell you how you can have your very own copies of these, but you've done rather extensive studies. And by the way, you've taken a lot of your own personal time and money to back up what is a complex operation to discover what exactly.
Well, we brought a team together, and first of all, I want to thank our donors who contributed to this, and one couple who do not want to be named in particular. And the team that we brought down was Mondo Gonzalez, our archaeologist, Our anthropologist is Rick Woodward, who has had examined these casts and other, not only photographs, but other casts, and done his own research with that. Chase Klotsky was our forensic field expert who set everything up, tagged and bagged all the samples, and was absolutely stellar in her approach. Richard Shaw, the director of Watchers, filmed everything, made a wonderful 6-minute film about just our whole trek over the years and how we've learned over the years. We had complete suits from the DNA Paleo Lab in Canada. We were donned from head to foot. We had masks and double gloves. So the idea of contamination is always there, and we totally understand that.
Right.
But the way we went into these artifacts to get the material, we would take the skull and we would turn it upside down like this. And then what we would do is we would take a Dremel tool. Remember, we're completely masked, and we would take the Dremel tool and scrape off the outer layer of bone, and then take another Dremel tool and penetrate into the skull, getting fresh genetic material, which falls on a blank piece of paper, which has been basically blown off with air, compressed air. And after that initial scraping on the underside of the skull, we would blow the skull off with compressed air and then go in and get fresh genetic material, falls on the paper. That's immediately tagged and bagged, put in another envelope. Chase marks it, and it's gone. So is there always a chance of contamination? We get that. But that's why we did multiple samples of different skulls, not only from the Ica Museum, ICA, the Inca Museum in Ica, and the archaeologist there, Ruben Soto, basically oversaw the entire operation, but also the Paracas History Museum, which the skulls that and the material we took from them was much newer, much more fresh.
All right, back up a little bit, L.A. Where did you find these? What are they? We know that you went to Peru. Where in the world did you find this?
This is a Paracas skull. It comes from a place called Chongos. Chongos is a necropolis. It's a burial place. I've been there numerous times now. And modern day archaeologists, mainstream archaeologists will tell us that all this is cranial deformation. Cradle headboarding is when they take a small child and they wrap the child. They put plant material or wood material. They bind the head and they shape the head, and this practice is done on a global level. Okay, I get that. I understand that. And we're certainly not trying to state that all these skulls that we see here are the result of cranial deformation, cradle headboarding. We realize that that's a practice that was done. I get that. I understand that. What we're stating is these particular skulls, not all, were the result of cranial deformation. And what's amazing about this, our team, Rick Woodward, Mando Gonzalez, our archaeologist, Dr. Elday, who's a medical doctor that came in, and also Dr. Warren, who's a chiropractor, examined these. There are morphological differences. What I mean by that, in the actual structure of the skull, which is not, does not relate to modern humans. One of the most telling, and Dr. Elday has weighed in on this, is the lack of a sagittal suture. In a normal human being, you should see a suture. This is a suture, by the way, right here. You should see a suture that goes from the frontal plate back to the occipital plate, the rear plate. It's lacking. There's a disease called cranial synostosis, which closes that sagittal suture. We understand that. But in many, not all, but many of the Paracas skulls, no matter what age, it's a lack of a sagittal suture. And okay, that's the first mark. The patterns, the suturing is wrong. But to us, what is really the smoking gun, other than the DNA evidence, and we'll get to that, is the placement of the foramen magnum. And I want to zoom in on this so you can see it. This little hole here, this area, is called the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is the place where the spinal column comes up and joins to the skull, like this. The problem is, you can see the foramen magnum here is as far back to the occipital plate as it possibly can go. And Dr. Alday, Rick Woodward, Mando Gonzalez, we all think and posit that there's no way you can put pressure on the rear plate of an infant's head and bring it closer to the foramen magnum. So we've got morphological differences in the skull. And this is our study. No one else has come up with that. And we tip our hat to our anthropologist, Rick Woodward, who first, and he actually wrote a paper, which is, by the way, is in the book on this.
And by the way, an artist's conception of what this creature might have looked like features a very long neck. And when the artist tried to draw what this person would look like with skin, growing over the skull, and then what would it look like if you had a neck attached to that very strange location at the base of the skull, and your artists came up with a very long-necked individual.
Marcia Moore, and there was no collusion between us. She looked at the placement of the foramen magnum, and she thought to herself, this is all wrong. This won't work. In order to balance the skull, perhaps the neck was longer. So she sends me this picture of what this particular, entity would have looked like, and a very long neck. And I wrote her back and I said, Marcia, are you aware that in the biblical narrative, one of the so-called Nephilim tribes are called the Anakim, which means the long necks. Now, I want to clarify something, folks. We're not stating that these are Nephilim skulls. We don't know that yet. I can't say it any clearer. We have a hypothesis, and which is based on the scientific method. Here's our hypothesis. Now we're going out to prove that. And it's taken 5 years to get to this point. There's morphological differences, which are not there. Dr. Alday, our medical doctor, after examining, and by the way, some of these skulls do not have something which are called the foramen ovales. These are two holes which are in front of the foramen magnum, where the blood vessels and nerve endings go into the face, which gives us the variety of facial expressions we can use. In many of the Paracas skulls, there's a complete absence of the foramen ovales, and that should not be there. So we've got structural, morphological differences within the skulls themselves. And of course, the DNA evidence is pointing to...
And I want to go back to Numbers chapter 13, one of the key points in Bible history where there was a people, as mentioned here in Numbers 13 and verse 28, nevertheless the people be strong that dwell in the land, the cities are walled and very great, and moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. Well, Anak means long-necked. And the plural, if you add the I-M on the ending, is the plural of Anak, is Anakim, the long-necked ones. And all this just fits together beautifully. And again, I just have to point out, this is at a key point in Bible history. The Anakim were the ones whom God said must be wiped out. You take your men in, and I will stand behind you, and we'll wipe out those giants. And they didn't.
That's exactly what happened,
and
to a point.
Yeah. So we're working here in an area that is not certain, but it points in a particular direction.
So far, the evidence is validating our hypotheses, and we're excited by that. There are no conclusions. We're not drawing any conclusions. We can't draw any conclusions. As I stated earlier, we've got this much of a picture, which is much larger. And what we've realized after researching for 5 years, we now have more questions than we do answers, which is why we need to go back to the Chongos necropolis and conduct a proper archaeological dig and go down, because they're buried deep. They're buried 30, even maybe 40 feet below the surface, is where the original inhabitants of the area are buried, and that's what we need to find out. There is no nuclear DNA on any of the skulls so far. We've got a little bit from one of the skulls, but it wasn't enough to do anything with. The nuclear would give us the key to the mystery. But however, and this is what's exciting, well over 30 samples, it's closer to 40 samples of DNA that we've done. The majority of them, drum roll please, show a Middle Eastern European origin haplogroup. Everything from T2B, this is the baby skull which we unwrapped, and this was estimated to be under 2 years old. The hair was reddish blonde, as you can see here. Haplogroup U2E, which is European. And again, the critics and the naysayers will say contamination, contamination, contamination. The hair samples on this is a 2,000-year-old mummy skull which we unwrapped. When we unwrapped that, the hair was immediately tagged and bagged by Chase Klotsky, immediately tagged in bag. And so why is it that all the contamination always points back to a European origin, and this skull was tested 3 times, coming up with the same haplogroup? So we have a real problem, because that's not supposed to be there. And what it does is it validates, at least on some level, our hypotheses that these entities coming from the Middle East, and that's what we think.
Now,
happened.
what's interesting, if you study European history and Middle Eastern history, going back to Sumer and Assyria, every culture has story after story after story of odd-looking, many times gigantic people. And some of the old cave paintings and sculptures show odd-looking people with elongated heads. Even in Egypt,
King Tut,
for example, very elongated heads, like we're looking at
and
here.
Nefertiti.
And so what you're doing essentially is validating the biblical view of the world rather than, if you will, the secular view of the world.
Absolutely.
Well, keep
That's
up the good
whole
work,
point.
and you've got your work cut out.
Absolutely, we certainly do.
And again, I want to mention here the DVD, DNA results. When you get a copy of DNA results, what are you going to see?
You're going to see 8 people presenting live at the Marriott bound by LAX. We're flying everyone in. We've already recorded this. It's fantastic. You'll see Richard Shaw with his incredible video. Brian Forrester presented. Our anthropologist, Mondo Gonzalez, will actually give the DNA analyses. Rick Woodward, our anthropologist, comes in and talks about the morphological differences. Dr. Alday, MD, comes in, and again, he states in his opinion that we're looking at a subspecies. Our chiropractor, Dr. Malcolm Warren, will weigh in and talk about the elongated neck and all of that. Marcia Moore, the illustrator, is also there presenting her work. Chase Klotsky, our forensic field investigator. So you'll see actually 8 or 9 people present, and myself included, all the findings, all the information. The DVD is over 2 hours long.
And the book form?
And the book form, everyone comes in on that also.
All right.
So both of these are composites.
And we have these, of course, for a gift to Prophecy Watchers of $50, free shipping anywhere in the United States. Or call the 800 number on your screen and order these books. The DNA results, the book, the DVD, for a gift of $50. Exciting, groundbreaking work you're not going to find anywhere else. And you've seen me validate the hypothesis just from Scripture. You read, and we've only touched a fragment, a tiny, tiny amount of the Scripture that speaks of these things in ways that stimulate your thinking. Wow, what a mystery. What was really going on there? What was God commanding his people to do? Usually, this stuff is shoved aside as unbelievable, but you're bringing it out into
We're on the trail.
Bringing it out into the light of day.
Behind me, as you can see on the monitor, my good friend Mondo Gonzalez. Mondo is an archaeologist. He's also a pastor. Don't hold that against him. I'm also a pastor too. Woo! Careful, KGRAers. You might. I promise we won't get religious on you tonight. I promise. Okay. But Mondo's a pastor, and so am I. And we love Jesus. He's really amazing, and we think he's coming back soon. But I completely digress. Mondo is an archaeologist, and he's got a master's degree in archaeology. Mondo was the man that contacted me several years ago when I put an ad up on the blog asking for an archaeologist that might be able to help us get the paperwork done specifically for the DNA testing. Mondo spent a lot of time, and the paperwork it's detailed, it's lengthy, it's a process. It took us years to get that. Mondo, welcome to Acceleration Radio. Tell us about the process before we get into the actual DNA results. What was it like? What did you have to go through?
Well, first of all, the challenge that we had was just finding a local archaeologist down there in Peru that would take an interest in what we were doing. And you and I, as we talked, we were surprised that for the most part, there's not a lot of interest in finding really the background and the history, the genetic history of these skulls. So that was the first stage. And then simply just trying to dot our I's with all the expectations of the Ministry of Culture that they wanted from us. So we had to present it full background, what our phases were, what our hypotheses were, some of the history, of course, of the digging and the excavations that have gone on already down there. So back and forth. Again, as you know, government is no different around the world. They wanted it very thorough, which we eventually accomplished, and they accepted it.
And how long did that take? How long did the actual process take for us to do that before we actually had written permission to come down?
Oh man, well, I started the work in July of 2014, and I think we finally got permission around July, August, I think, of 2016.
So it's
2 full years.
Yeah, 2 full years, and I'll never forget. We got a letter from Ruben, an email from Ruben, the archaeologist down at the Inca Museum, giving us this window. Remember that, like a 4 or 5 week window to come down, and it's like, oh, we're just all going to drop everything, but we did, and the team was yourself, Chase Klotsky, our forensic field investigator, and she was amazing, absolutely amazing, and then film director Richard Shaw, who documented everything on film, did a really thorough job. So without Chase, and let's start with Chase, because Chase is absolutely amazing. And it was just the 4 of us. There was no one else involved in the DNA extraction. Now, with all due respect to Brian Forrester, Brian was instrumental on keeping that channel open with Ruben and us. And he would travel to Inca and did it numerous times and kept that channel open. But it was the 4 of us who actually met Ruben, finally went there, and, you know, we landed in Lima. We drove to Paracas. We stayed in Paracas, and then at the appointed time, we drove to Ica. When we were there, everything was shut down. The museum was closed for the day. So they bring us into a back room off the museum, and Chase is there with all of her paraphernalia, all of her equipment. And she basically set up a sterile environment. And what I mean by that, you have to see it on film. And you know, there's a film which you can watch on YouTube and see some of this for free. It's there. But also in the book that we have, you know, basically on the DNA, Chase goes detailed, very, very detailed information of what happened. So she creates this sterile environment for us, and you and I are in our full lab suits. Tell us about the lab suits that you and I are dressed in, and then how we actually went into the room where Chase had prepared everything. Give us sort of an overview there.
Well, a little bit of background too. I want to give credit to the Paleo Lab in Ontario, Canada, because you know, we had already spent some time doing some extractions in Oregon a couple different times, and so again, in our desire to be, you know, fully, you know, contamination free, if that's not even possible, the best as we could, we talked to them. They sent us all the suits. They gave us what they can do in the lab. Now, granted, you know, as an archaeologist, when you're out in the field, there's no way that when you're in a dirt pit and you have a skeleton and you want to keep it in situ in the ground, and you're going to do some extractions, that's not a sterile environment either. So you do the best you can with the environment you have. So that's a little bit of background. So that when we went in there, you know, we're walking into this vacant room at a museum. We had everything out of there. Chase went in there, sterilized everything, bleach, water. I mean, all the different things that she used to sterilize it. We brought all the stuff that we brought was all sterile, suits, multiple suits, and everything else to get started. So again, we go in there, we're garbed to the hilt. As people maybe or may not know, you and I, as well as Richard, gave our DNA for comparisons to make sure there's no contamination. What we did is we would go in there, and we would take the extraction, and we would put it in the vial. We would close the vial up, seal it from our end, and then we'd hand it to Chase, who would then do all the record keeping and everything from beginning to end. So, you know, there was no room for, I mean, we did the best that we could. I mean, even between skulls, you and I would go out and change our garments head to toe because, again, we had been, you know, there's always stuff on the internet. We had been accused of not following proper procedures, but again, there's lots of books out there. You talk to the lab, and as you know, after we were done, we got complimented by both labs.
That's correct. For the efforts that we put in to keep it contamination free as much as possible. And all I remember, a lot of details. They brought out all these skulls in boxes, and I mean, these things have been jostled around. Certainly, contamination is a possibility. And,
Sure.
and our retort to that is the way we went into these artifacts. We had a whole slew of Dremel bits, Dremel tools, and so we would go in and clean the surface of the artifact, the surface of a skull, usually on the underside of the skull, so not to jeopardize its look or its integrity, its external integrity. So we were turning a skull upside down, usually around the foramen magnum, but sometimes the upper jaw in that area, the mandible, and we would clean a section of the skull and then go in and get fresh powder. And as that fresh powder would fall, that's what we would collect and put in the vial. So after that, and we would take multiple samples, that's when we would go outside the room, completely take off all of our lab suits, everything, and then blow each other off with compressed air, don new lab suits, go back in and take another round of DNA samples from another skull. How many samples or how many skulls did we actually test at ICA?
We actually tested 8. They gave us 9, but there was one of the skulls, number 6. We decided we didn't want to test that one. So out of 9 skulls, we tested 8.
And then how many at the Paracas Museum did we test?
I know we had 18 altogether, but there was about 4 or 5 plus the 8. That makes 13. So we had about 5 or 6 there at the museum.
And I just want to take a moment and thank, all this is really based on the work of Senior Juan Navarro, who actually was the curator of the Paracas History Museum. And when Brian sort of discovered this and came under Senior Juan's wing, I think it's safe to say that, he was his mentor for a period of time. Senior Juan is no longer with us, but the museum is still there, and Mondo and I will be going down towards the end of July. We'll be leading a tour in Paracas, in Ica, in Lima, and then we'll shoot up into Cusco, the Sacred Valley, Ollantaytambo, and of course Machu Picchu. More about that in the coming days ahead, maybe even by this weekend. So let's get back into the DNA extraction. So how many samples did we actually take, and how many were processed?
So we had 58 samples altogether that were processed. Of those, we had 27 that came back with sufficient amount of a haplogroup DNA to define a haplogroup. So you could see even there, I mean, out of 58, we were only able to obtain 27 from 18 different skulls. And we took multiple samples from those skulls. But as you know, the challenge is that a lot of the DNA, 30-some of the samples, 31 of them, were just too degraded. But of the 27, which represented 18 skulls, we were able to define several, all the haplogroups for those 18. But we sent them to the 2 different labs, and it was nice when we had collaboration, especially between the 2 labs. That was very impressive.
Why don't you tell us about, and I know people are chomping at the bit, and I've been kind of, leeching this out, but I think it's time, to talk about the DNA. And again, if you want more detailed information, get the DVD because it's almost 3 hours long, and of course the book, a lot of detailed information. But let's sort of spill the beans here because I think it's time. People are always saying, why aren't you releasing this information? Well, I've been sick for 2 weeks. This is the first time I've really been able to release it. By the way, Monday, I will be on Coast to Coast, and I'll also be talking about this in greater detail with George Norrie. But I digress. So Mondo, tell us, the baby skull, which we unwrapped, which we did carbon-14 testing, was about 1,935 years old. And that was tested in 2 different labs, 3 different times. Tell us what the results were there.
Well, the results for those, we had a hair sample and a bone sample, and those both came back U2E and U2E1, which are Middle East. And to me, very clear. We had the carbon dating as well pre-Columbian times. Amazing result.
So when we say, now this is only 1 skull, and people will immediately point to contamination, but it was tested 3 different times by 2 different labs without any corroboration between them. They came up with the same result, U2E1. And this was a mummy, a mummy that had been wrapped up. Basically, we got to unwrap it, and Chase was there, Chase Klotsky, our forensic investigator, and she tagged and bagged everything immediately. So while I'll admit, contamination is always the fallback that, the academics and the scientific community. And our retort to that is, how many samples do we have to do and test before we can at least say that something is going on here and maybe more testing needs to be done, which is what we're saying. We've drawn no conclusions here. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, we have the results. The data speaks for themselves. How we interpret it, where we go from there, well, that's up in the air, but the facts speak for themselves.
So we're not saying these are aliens or these are Nephilim. We're not saying any of that. I want to make that really clear. But what we are saying is it seems that over 2,000 years ago, or certainly in the baby's case, that people migrated from the New World. And this is the claim which people say is sensationalistic, but it really isn't. If that's true, if it's based on the science, it's based on the data, that rewrites history. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and it's not just one skull. I mean, we have 18 different skulls, and in our report, we have provided all of the results. Again, we're not sifting through, leaving out some that don't fit what our hypotheses are. We're sharing all of it.
Because some of the haplogroups came back B1, which is exactly what you would see in Amerindian population. First Nation people.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that's in the report also. Tell us about the Middle Eastern connection, specifically from the basically T2B, and we had several artifacts, the cinnamon skull and then the Oregon skull. Talk about that and the DNA results there, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll kind of just highlight it because I'm looking at it right now. We had 6 samples from the Paracas area specifically, at least from the ones that we handled. And, we have Middle East, we got Europe from 2 different labs confirmed that. We also had a haplogroup K, which again was from the Near East.
Wasn't that? Isn't K Druze? Isn't K the Druze people?
Yeah, K can be part of the Druze too. Yep.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Please continue with the report.
So those are the Paracas skulls that show a Middle Eastern connection, and those are pretty consistent. Now with the Oregon skull that you and I had done, which was from La Arroya, Peru, at least that's what it said on there.
Right.
That one came back from T2B, which was specifically Syria or Turkey. So what we're seeing is a lot of the haplogroups coming from the Middle East. But of course, the Middle East is a central point, as we know, anyway. So you see several of the parent haplogroups, which will branch off from the Middle East, and some of them will go to Africa, some will go to Europe, like H. Others will head into the Black Sea area, and we've seen that too. Like I believe, what was the other one? Like the T2B heads over in that direction. So there was several that came from like West Eurasia, the Black Sea area. That was fascinating. So cinnamon skull came back, T2B, the Oregon skull. The cinnamon skull, which was given to us, I wasn't there for that one, but we had it too.
And let me just hold that up. That is this artifact right here. This is called the cinnamon skull. This is obviously a model made by Joe Taylor, who just did an incredible job. And you can see how elongated it is. And there are morphological differences in the skull, which we might have time to get into. If not, we'll come back next week and talk about that. But let's continue with the DNA.
Yeah, so that one specifically came to J1B1, which was a Eurasia haplogroup. And then when we got into the ecoskulls, when I talked to Ruben, the local archaeologist there for the National Museum, the regional museum anyway, they're all from 2 places, either the Chongos necropolis area or another place called the Cerrado for Colorado. And both of them were from looted funerary contexts,
right.
So cemeteries.
Right.
So we did have some, at least, and they were all drawn by professional archaeologists and then put into the museum. And so Ruben wanted us to check those out and to find haplogroups. And so for those, we had all of those samples from those 8 skulls presented to 2 labs, and a lot of the samples were very degraded. I mean, as you said in the intro, they're sitting in boxes. They're just the level of decay was pretty bad.
And this so is and let me just jump in here for a second because we're down to like a 5-minute mark here.
Okay.
we've drawn no conclusions here. We've just presented the data. This is what the data is saying. So if you want to, you can view the data. We're telling you what it is. Get the DVD, get the book. The data is in the book. We have no conclusions. We've stated this right from the get-go, but it does rewrite history, because if what we should be expecting is all Eurasian, and that's not what we're seeing. So what this means, or you can interpret it as this, that either there was a transatlantic migration or a trans-Pacific migration, or perhaps both. We don't know. That part's conjecture on everybody's part. We just don't know. We can go into Native American First Nation people in the United States, where it talks about six-fingered red-haired giants, but we didn't go there with this. All we did was present the data. This is what the data states. And the data states not all, but some are Eurasia or Middle East or Europe. So kind of wrap things up here for us. And next week we'll be back on Acceleration Radio again. I'm going to bring Mondo back in. We're going to talk about the morphological differences of the Paracas skull, specifically the work of Rick Woodward, who was our anthropologist. We actually may try to do a three-way Skype. Dr. Michael Alday, who is a medical doctor who weighed in, just an incredible presentation. And then Dr. Malcolm Warren, who is a chiropractor, who weighs in on all of this. So, the team that we put together, an archaeologist, a anthropologist, a medical doctor, and a chiropractor. I mean, these are all highly educated people that are really basically, top in their field on some level. I mean, it's not like they're world renowned, but they're engaged actively in what they do. And to have all these four guys come on the record and state what they stated at the press conference was just incredible. So take us home. We got about 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, from the eco skulls, kind of wrap it up, we had, again, several of them came back as B4, which is Southeast Asia, very expected for the indigenous population there. We did have a couple others come back as Europe and another one as Eurasia. So to me, when you step back and you just look at the DNA itself, we do have a conclusion in the sense that the DNA speaks for itself. That we aren't saying that this is speculative report or a speculative analysis.
Right.
This is exactly what the DNA showed. So that is very much a conclusion. Now, again, how they got there, well,
we don't know.
Who knows?
We don't know that.
We
yet.
don't know. Mm-hmm.
And we may never know. I mean, we just unless we can go to a tomb at Changos or wherever and find maybe writing, which so far no one has ever found, that would be very telling. But we don't know. So it's speculation at this point. But it seems like there seems to have been, I think it's fair to say that there was a migration thousands of years ago from the Middle East and Europe to the New World. Whether it's from the Atlantic or the Pacific, we have no idea. We know that Thor Heyerdahl proved, and I opened up my presentation at the press conference, showing that you can build a reed boat, a papyrus boat, and basically sail across the Atlantic, and you wind up on the island of Barbados, which of course is the New World, without a compass, just by rolling up your sail. So he proved in modernity that it could be done. And again, Mondo and I both want to stress, and Mondo's putting his archaeological degree on the line, his expertise on the line. He's not interpreting the data. He's just telling us and telling, all of us here what the data says. This is what the DNA came back from the lab. We have the reports. Some of the reports, are the reports in the book? Did we include some of the reports in the book?
No, we didn't include the reports in the book, but I will say this, that, out of 58 samples, what's seen in the book is the 27 results.
Right.
And I'll just say again, some of it was degraded, but also want to say that I did not include in the report anything that was half reported, or the DNA was really degraded to such a degree that they weren't sure. I eliminated all those. That's why you go from 58 to 27. So the results that we have are solid. There's nothing half in there at all.
Right, and
I just want to say that.
And that's why, I mean, look, I know people are skeptical out there. I totally get it, and it's good to be skeptical. But here's the data. So don't argue with, ad hominem attacks. Look at the data. The thing speaks for itself. And folks, we're back. Acceleration Radio right here on KGRA. I'm your intrepid host, L.A. Marzulli. As you can see, my good friend in the background, our anthropologist on the On the Trail team, on our DNA retrieval team, Rick Woodward. Rick, welcome to Acceleration Radio.
Great to be here, L.A. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. We want to get right into it, folks. And here is, this is what we call a cinnamon skull. And Rick took a look at this, and it was Rick's expertise and his, I would almost want to say, exhaustive research that really moved our study into an area which up till his research, no one on the planet that I'm aware of had discovered what Rick discovered. And I'll let him tell you what he discovered. Thanks, Rick. Go ahead.
Well, as you know, I got involved with your team in 2016. You sent me some photographs to take a look at, and I just, as an anthropologist, we're taught to look at patterns. We're taught to look for things that are in what we would call normal patterns or specific patterns, and then when something stands out from that, that's going to catch our attention. So what we did, I took a look at the photos that you sent, and then I said, why don't you send me some photos of the base of the skull? And that's the bottom part of the skull. I think I got a skull right here.
Yeah, hold it up a little bit more. So there you go. Perfect.
That's the bottom part of the skull. And the reason I wanted to look at the bottom part of the skull is because, or the base of the skull, is because it is the part that even if you did head binding or cradle boarding or anything like that, that would be a part of the skull that would not be touched. It would not be interfered with. Well, when we got the skulls and we got the photos and stuff, and I started to look at them, some really interesting things started to pop up. One of the things that I noticed right off the bat was the foramen magnum, which is the big hole that your neck bone attaches to. Your spinal column goes into your skull. It was actually moved far back. It looked like it was moved far back. I really would have to measure it to know for sure. And that's exactly what I did. I measured it, and we measured it in two different ways. We measured it from the palatal process, which is the roof of your mouth, back to the center of the foramen magnum. And then we also measured it across what is called the mandibular alignment. That's where your jawbone hooks up to your skull. And we found that there were significant differences, some of them up to 1 centimeter back from where they should be, 1.5 centimeters. The foramen magnum was back toward the posterior of the skull. You cannot do that with head binding, and you cannot do that with head wrapping. That absolutely, positively has to be genetically done. And we looked at also some things in the skull. The shape of the palate is more of a C shape rather than a U. In normal skulls, the palate looks like the way your teeth follow your palate. It's like a U. Well, in these skulls, in the skulls like the cinnamon skull, they're more like a C rather than a U. We also looked at some other things like the foramen ovalis. The foramen ovalis are 2 holes in the top of your palate that let the blood vessels and the nerves come down from the top of the palate into the jaw muscles, and actually allows you to chew, and it also allows you to make facial expressions. In the Paracas skulls, those ovales were completely missing, and there was no place for them. That's the important thing we need to remember, is that not only were they just missing, there's no place for them to be. It doesn't look like it might have been one there, or could have possibly had something there. There was nothing there. It was just flat bone. So we noticed that. The zygomatic processes are really large, and that's your cheekbones, are really large in the Paracas skulls, not like we see in a normal skull. Getting back to the foramen magnum, the foramen condyles, and the foramen condyles are two bones that hold your neck vertebrae in place. And in the Paracas skulls, they're actually reversed from Homo sapiens sapiens.
Wow.
Homo sapiens sapiens has a slot in the back that it slides in, and the Paracas skulls, the slot was in the front, which made a totally different morphology for that skull. You can't do that with head binding and with cradle boarding. It has to be genetic. Of course, we talked to Dr. Warren, Dr. Alday, the two other members of our team.
Right.
Dr. Warren is a medical Dr. Warren is a chiropractor. Dr. Alday is a medical doctor. And he said, he was in agreement with me that what we may be looking at is a subspecies. And, I don't mind going ahead and saying it here. I believe that we're looking at Homo sapiens sapiens paracasi.
Wow. Very, very interesting. And I just kind of love the way you just wrap that up in a nice little package for us. Do you have the cinnamon skull with you right there, a cast of it?
I do. I can get it. It's in a little case.
Yeah, get that. And what I'd love to have you do is walk through it again and point out the differences, because I know you've got the cast of the human skull there also. And what we can do is we can kind of take the novice through this whole thing, showing here's the foramen magnum, let's say in the human skull, here it is in the Paracas skull. Obviously, there's a disparity, and go from there. I think that'd be really interesting. So go ahead, Rick, do that again with the show and tell, as it were.
Okay. Well, like I said, we took a look at the photographs and the skulls themselves, the models, and which were one-to-one anatomically correct, absolutely perfect. And so I looked for the patterns that I would normally see in a human skull. If I were to look at this skull here, this is the lab skull. It's a normal human skull.
Yeah, there you go. Hold it up. Right.
This skull, then I would be looking at, I can see here are the foramen ovalis, the holes at the bottom of the palate. I can see the foramen magnum. Here are the foramen condyles on each side. And you can see this is that the structure of the palate is shaped more like a U or like a V.
Right.
So that's what I would want to see in a skull. Well, when we look at the cinnamon skull, then one of the first things that we see is that is this good enough?
Go towards your head and keep it real still. Right there. That's perfect.
Okay, I'm going to hold it real still.
That's perfect right there.
And one of the things you see here is that this foramen magnum is moved all the way back to the posterior of the skull. Now, some people would say, well, you mash the skull in.
Can't do that.
You can't mash the skull in because it would kill the individual. The second thing that we know that that's not true is because we measured it from the bottom of the palate here to the center of the foramen magnum, and we measured it across the mandibular alignment. When we did that, then what we found was that foramen magnum had moved to the back of the skull, probably maybe 1.5 centimeters, which actually is a whole lot. If you were to try to do that to a human being with head binding or cradle boarding, it would kill the individual.
Wow.
As you can see, I showed you the foramen magnums, the foramen ovales in the regular skull. If you look at this skull, they're completely missing. They're not there. And there's no place for them. There's just flat bone there where they should go in. So genetically, they never had them. So that's an amazing thing. To me, it's an amazing thing that we were able to find that. in these skulls. That would lead me to say that these people had a whole different stature, the way that they stood and the way that they walked. They had a whole different stature to balance that head, to keep that head balanced. And they would need a longer neck to hold that head up because, or either very massive neck muscles, and we don't see that.
We don't see that, right.
In any of the people. So undoubtedly, they probably had a longer neck, and that's how they held that skull in a way where they could balance it, where they could walk and do everyday things.
Let me ask you something. You know, both you're more than aware of my hypotheses. We're on the trail of the Nephilim. And we're not saying, we have to make that really clear, we're not saying that these are Nephilim skulls. We don't know. We only have a very small part of the puzzle. And after 5 years of research, we have more questions than answers. I get that. But what is your gut telling you? I mean, and I'm not trying to put you in a corner here, but what do you think we're looking at?
Well, combined with the DNA evidence that we currently have, and looking at the changes in the skull, I'm gonna agree with you that they probably came from the Middle East or Far Eastern Europe, somewhere in that area there. But I'm also going to say this too, that these people were extremely isolated. I believe they were isolated also in that area of the Middle East, and they moved out when the war was being pushed into their land. These people, we find the concept of the artificial cranial manipulation all over the world.
Sure.
So these people probably were known all over the world at one time. And we see people copying the way that their heads look, because they were probably very isolated people, had not been seen, and were considered, had some kind of status, But I do believe that your hypothesis is correct, that these people pressed out from the Middle East, and they ended up in several places. We haven't found all of them yet, but we've located them in Peru. And even in Peru, these people were extremely isolated.
Yes.
The area of Paracas is a very, very isolated place. And we see from looking at other skulls that have some type of artificial cranial manipulation that they had begun to intermarry probably with the people in that area, and that's what we began to see.
Now,
yeah, I agree with you.
Thank you. You showed us in the human skull the position of the foramen condyles. Show us, is there a way to talk about the foramen condyles in the cinnamon skull?
Sure, absolutely. Let me hold up the human skull first, and I want to explain the foramen condyles.
There you go.
The foramen condyles here, they're a locking mechanism that locks in the neck vertebrae into the skull, and they let you tilt your head and move it back and forth.
Right.
Okay, those types of things. That's what that does. Well, in this skull, you can see that the slot for that is on the front. You know, it's on the back right here. You can feel that slide on the back. Now I'm going to hold up the cinnamon skull and show you this.
Huh.
In the cinnamon skull, it's exactly opposite.
It's exactly opposite. Right.
It's exactly opposite. Not only that, but the foramen condyles here are very, very robust. They're maybe 3 times the size of a normal human skull. And I believe that was because this skull would have been kind of top-heavy, and it would have had to be more robust, so you could rock your head back and forth and go side to side. And that's what Dr. Alday and I had talked about, and that's what we believe was going on with the skulls, as far as the foramen condyles.
It's, you know, Rick, your work is absolutely stellar, and until you presented that paper, until you did the research, and tell us some of the backstory. I mean, you went. I mean, how many skulls did you study? I forget the woman that you went to, sort of like the grand dame of you know of skull binding, as it were. Tell us about that.
Exactly. Well, I actually went to several people. The first person that I approached was my mentor, Dr. Pete Gregory at Northwestern State University, and he said, be sure to look for, he told me what to look for. Be sure to look for things like epigenetics. Well, these people were so isolated that epigenetics would not have been a concern. So he
and just wait, let me stop you there. What are epigenetics? Let the folks know.
Well, epigenetics is the flow of genetics into a population. So it flows into a population, it flows out of a population. When we really start to see epigenetics is when we see them start to intermarry with the people around them. Then we start to see skulls that are elongated but have the foramen ovales and those types of things. And we know those skulls were artificially manipulated, the cranium was, most of them. Here, though, they're not. With the Paracas people, they're not. With Cinnamon Skull, they're not. And so Dr. Gregory told me what to look for. I talked to Ross Sackett, who is a evolutionary bioanthropologist at the University of Memphis. Boy, if you can get really specific in this field. Yeah, but he was at the University of Memphis, and he said he felt that no matter what you did to the top of the skull, it should not affect the base of the skull.
Right.
That eliminated that. Then I went to Dr. Teisler, Vera Teisler is the grand dame of elongated skulls. She's looked at thousands of these skulls. And I asked her, I said, if we do head binding on a skull, just general head binding or cradle boarding, how will that affect the base of the skull? She said, other than a small angular change, there should be nothing affected on the base of the skull because everything is from the ears up.
Right.
And so then I began to look at the skulls that you had sent me, and I said, we've really got something different here. There's a large different morphology. So I talked to a few other anthropologists and mainly wanted to talk to medical doctors. So I talked to my local chiropractor here. He said if you would move that foramen magnum like that, it would kill the individual. And so he agreed, his findings agreed with Dr. Warren. It came as a whole package of all these people that I talked to. I basically wanted to know what I wouldn't find first, and then I could look at it, the patterns, and I know if I saw something that was different, then that had to be genetic.
That's just incredible.
Yeah.
Rick, I just applaud you. It's incredible research. I can't thank you enough for being part of our team, and we're moving forward, which we won't talk about, but we've got some irons in the fire, which we're excited about. Folks, if you're interested in learning more about this, first of all, you've got the DVD. It's the entire press conference. You can watch Rick Woodward, our anthropologist, his entire presentation, as well as Dr. Michael Alday and Dr. Malcolm Warren, who we've been citing, all talking about the foramen magnum and the placement of the foramen magnum, a lack of foramen ovales. You'll want to get this DVD. Plus, Rick wrote a chapter in the book here, as well as everyone else, Richard Shaw, Brian Forrester, Chase Klodsky, myself, Mando Gonzalez, and everybody else wrote for this. And then, of course, you get the free bonus DVD, Mark of the Beast, and the Alien Implant Connection. All this for $39.99. And you know what? When you support us, we keep going, because this is what keeps the lights on. This is what keeps the research going. And again, we'd like to thank our sponsors who gave us a sizable donation, which got us out in the field, which enabled us to take 58 samples and get them tested at the Paleo DNA lab. before we go, I want to talk about one thing which we didn't talk about tonight: craniosynostosis, the lack of the sagittal suture in many of the Paraka skulls. Rick, I'm holding up the cinnamon skull here for our audience. Hold up your cinnamon skull and tell us
Sure.
what's going on here with that, please.
Well, with cranial stenosis, one of the things that happens is you have a sagittal suture that goes across here and actually closes up once you begin to grow from a child. We don't find that in these skulls. They're missing. And there's no indication of disease, because disease always leaves something, leaves a sign or leaves a trace. And one of the signs and traces of cranial stenosis is that they would have either like what we call perforated areas in the skull, some other type of indicator left behind, like a lump or something like that. We don't see any of that. It's just a straight, flat skull, and we know for a fact by looking at that, it never had the suture.
That's just unbelievable. Folks, that's all the time we have for tonight. Rick Woodward, I applaud you, sir. I'm just so happy you're part of our team. We're still on the trail. We got, like I said, we have irons in the fire, and as we get more results and whatever, we will let people know about it, just like we did with the live streaming event down at LAX. Thanks so much for coming on the record, Rick. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
God bless you.
All right.
Folks, remember, you're listening to Acceleration Radio. My guest, Dr. Michael Alday, MD. I first met him at a conference, and he came up and we discussed the elongated skulls, and from there, the relationship grew. And at the press conference, Dr. Alday presented, and I don't want to hog the time because time's going to go very quickly, but Doc, thanks for coming on the record here. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're more than welcome, L.A.
So I'm just going to turn it over to you. So tell us about the foramen magnum, and of course, Rick Woodward, who we had on last week, discussed the position of the foramen magnum, and naysayers are saying that all of us is cradle headboarded. What say you?
Well, I agree with Rick Woodward that this is just very anomalous. You know, when you look at how cranial deformation occurs, you know, there's two types: the traditional wrapping, or using the board where it basically squeezes the head downward to make the conical shape. But whether you do either one of those, as a physician, and I've been a physician 35 years, I've done occupational medicine, I've treated multitudes of spinal injuries, I've seen skull fractures, you know, examined MRIs, x-rays, and I got to tell you, to push the foramen magnum, and that's where your spinal cord basically goes up into your brain, in the brain stem, you can't move it 1 to 2 centimeters posterior like that. I know you have bone molding like you have in a fracture. When you have an angulated fracture, sometimes the orthopedic surgeon will just let it heal naturally, and the pressures that be will form it back. But there's no way to move a hole of this magnitude, especially an important hole like the foramen magnum, posterior 1 to 2 centimeters posterior backwards. It can't happen.
Well, let me ask you something. Could you crush the occipital plate and move the occipital plate closer to the foramen magnum? Is that possible?
You mean the occipital plate in the back?
Yeah. Could you crush it? Could you move that closer to the foramen magnum?
Well, you would, if you did that, you would see severe deformity of the occipital plate. But when you look at these Paraka skulls, they look nice and smooth. I mean, you would have some scarring or deformity in bone scarring. You know, like just like if you break your clavicle, you know, you fall down off your bike, you see evidence of bone molding. And we talk about this craniosynostosis. I know the big thing out there is Well, the sagittal suture goes away because it's early cranial synostosis, and it just goes away. Well, there's always telltale signs. If there's early closing of the sagittal suture, you're going to see the signs of that. Also with cranial headboarding, there's going to be evidence. There's going to be a ridge line, and I actually got a picture in one of my presentation slides of the cranial synostosis. And it shows that ridge line, you know, the scarring formation. So there's a telltale sign if it is cranial synostosis. I think it's slide number 13.
Okay.
I don't know if you can go to that really quick.
I can't, so you're going to have to hold it up, or we'll bring this up in post-production.
Okay.
There you
go. This is the one in my presentation that can actually show there, especially this one right here. There's a ridge line.
Right.
You see that ridge line right there?
I do, yes.
So you all have some evidence of early closing of that sagittal suture. The only suture line that disappears totally is the metopic suture, and that's in the frontal, on the frontal plate. And by 2 years, most everyone has the metopic suture go away. So that's the only one that I know of, especially in the medical literature and being a physician and my training. You never see the metopic suture. Sometimes you might see it, and even the radiologist may even call it a fracture line mistakenly. But after a CT or MRI, you see that it may be a residual metopic suture. That's rare. That's rare. So there's always that sagittal suture line. All the MRIs I've ever seen and X-rays, you see telltale signs of the sagittal suture. That's why this Paracas skull and also even the organ skull, I think, has anomaly of the sagittal suture, where it's basically, especially the Paracas ones, they're just not there. And there's too many of them to just explain that this is just a freak of nature, one or two. You know, anything can happen in medicine, naturally. You know, nothing's always black and white in medicine, but there are too many of them that show that, you know, they're all missing. It's like a whole lineage line, so to speak. So who are these people? That's what I want to know.
Well, I think we all do. Let me ask you something. That we know that the foramen condyles, which are the bones that help the skull balance on the spinal column, are completely different. Please speak to that. Please speak to the foramen condyles.
Yeah. Okay, I got a good picture here. Here's one of my slides, the foramens of the skull. Let me hold it up. And here's a normal skull. And what we're talking about are these two little things called the condyle. And remember Atlas holding up the world?
Sure.
Remember Atlas, Mr. Atlas? Well, there's the first vertebra is called Atlas for a reason. It's holding up the head with those two condyles. Now, if you look at the Paracas skulls, you know, here's that example, you know, just very normal small condyles right there by the foramen magnum. You can see the little white ones. They're kind of white oval-shaped things. Those are the actual joints that connect the first vertebra to the spine.
And what number slide is that, Doc?
That's number 7.
Okay.
And that's slide number 7.
Okay. Yeah, just tell us the slides as you show them, okay?
Right. That was number 7. Now, if you go and look at the, let's get to the Paracas ones. And Rick, I think, had a better example of the actual base of the skull of the Paracas skulls. Okay, there it is. There's one that's a good one. And this is number 22.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you look at number 22, okay.
Right, wow.
And you can see the difference, and it's shifted anterior, and they're a lot bigger. Okay, well, it's just like your patella of the knee, the kneecap. You're actually born without a kneecap, and the forces of the joints and ligaments as you move through time and as you start walking on two legs, your kneecap forms.
Wow.
Same thing that's happening here, in my opinion, is these condyles have shifted anteriorly and become more huge. That's some kind of pressure effect. So I think, just like Marcia Moore, our last speaker at the presentations, excellent renditions of what these creatures or these specimens, humanoids, I don't know what, whoever these people were, must have had long necks, because you can see that these things are more anterior, the condyles, where the force of all the weight of the skull going into the spine, and how big they are, they had to have had elongated necks. So and we hear through American culture, both North, Central, and South American cultures, about long necks. So I think that needs to be explored more.
And of course,
to find specimens of long necks.
From my perspective, bringing in the idea of transmigration from the Middle East, because of the haplogroups which showed European/Middle Eastern origin, is it possible that we're looking at specifically the tribe known as the Anakim, which means long necks? And of course, that's total conjecture on our part, but nevertheless, that's something to consider. We can't rule that out yet, because that's certainly a possibility. There are other morphological differences in these skulls, other structural differences in the skulls. Talk about some of those, please.
Yeah. Well, and Rick Woodward had some very good examples, and this is slide number 7, where, there's 12 other holes, the minor foramen they call it, okay?
Okay.
And all these holes have different functions, the two most notable being the foramen ovale, which, if you show the graph up there, you could pick that out. These are the ones that are, okay, let's see, right there. Foramen ovale are those two oval shaped. That's why they call it ovale. They're oval shaped. The fifth, or the trigeminal nerve, which is the main sensory nerve to the face, enter and exit there. Also, back behind there, there's stylomastoid foramen that houses the facial nerve that gives you facial expression. When you look at the examples, and I had an example, and also Rick had some excellent examples during his presentation of the Paracas skulls, and also when we looked at the Oregon skull, it's like they're not even there. It's I'm trying to find that one.
And that would have nothing to do with cradle headboarding at all.
Yeah, no. Why? How could cranial headboarding have deformed or misplaced foramens? Here's the example we have of the Oregon skull. None of those foramens are where they should be. There's some that maybe be combined right here. You see this real long one here, but you can't see the traditional foramen ovale. You can't see the traditional stylomastoid foramen. They're in different locations. So did they have anomalous facial features? I don't know. Maybe they got rerouted somehow. But there's several examples of these skulls that the foramen ovales and the other minor ovales are misplaced or even missing. So we need to find more examples to corroborate that line of thinking that, what's going on with these missing foramen. And also the big one, the posterior foramen magnum, and also the sagittal suture, in my mind, is kind of a smoking gun, in my opinion, where the sagittal suture is just not there. I mean, it's so smooth, and I know there's talk through, and I've seen a lot of the internet articles and also some things in journals that, well, that could have been by cranial headboard. And well, if you're mashing the two parietal plates together, that's going to cause a ridge. I'm sorry. Just like with the craniosynostosis, with the early closing of the sagittal suture, you're going to have a telltale sign, just like you break your clavicle. I can tell if you broke your clavicle by doing an x-ray, because it shows scarring of the bone. It wouldn't be smooth, like nothing ever happened, like a baby's bottom, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, we would see proof, and that's why we can always tell that you've had fractures, because it leaves evidence. So why are these so ultra smooth? That cannot be explained by cranial deformation. That's my opinion.
So I know that you and I discussed this, and you even wrote about it in the book that we have, basically the DNA evidence. You've gone as far, sort of out on a limb professionally, stating that what we're looking at, this might be a new species. Speak to that. That's quite a statement to make.
Well, it is, and I think more research needs to be done. I'm really impressed with the DNA, evidence showing that there's mixtures. It's not the pure race that they thought it was. Is there some mixture going on way back with Middle Eastern European bloodlines? But when you really look at the skulls, and they look so different, and you can't imagine that, and we can't physiologically explain that this is all from cranial deformation.
Right.
Then what are we looking at? Is it the hybrid species, the mixture of, of course, we all talk biblically of the fallen angels, but if you just look from a scientific perspective, these people don't fit. They just don't fit the natural course. When you look all the headboarding that went on in Africa, the Middle East, even in North America with the Chinookan tribe, traditional headboarding, and they were probably masters at it up in North America. These Paragas people just don't fit any of that. So it's like they're, I hate to use the word subspecies, but they're certainly so different. We need to get more samples, more testing, and I'm with you on, getting nuclear DNA to delve down into who these people really are, where they come from. Is there something else mixed in there too, with the genomes? Very interesting stuff. So I think just some more research needs to be done for sure.
And that's the whole point of why we did the press conference, was to take the data that we have and present that to the public. And we flew in, all 8 of us presented. And of course, folks, you can get the book and the DVD and the bonus DVD going to lamarzulli.net, lamarzulli.net. And we appreciate your patronage, because when you do that, it helps us keep the lights on and keep doing further research. And that's what we're all about. We've got some leads with some other artifacts, which we've been talking about, and we'll see what pans out with them. But what would be your closing thoughts with these enigmatic Paracas elongated skulls? What just give us wrap it up for us.
Well, like you say, it takes time and money, and research is, any kind of research you do of this nature, it's always an evolution, an evolving process. So
Sure.
I think more needs to be done. More hypotheses need to be thrown out there. I think, especially when I look at these megalithic structures that are built down there, and then what was over in Lebanon and the Middle East, I mean, 100-ton objects, and they're just not in Peru over there, and of course Easter Island with these huge figures. You know, they're just scattered all through the Middle East. Where's the connection with the, you know, the giants? Of course, the Bible says, you know, their giants roamed the land, and there probably still are giants. We just, you know, haven't found them yet. But I think more research needs to be done. It'd be great in the Middle East. Of course, you know, we're closer to Peru and South America here. It's cheaper, but certainly in Europe and Middle East, doing some exploration, especially around those areas where they had the megalithic structures. It'd be neat to see if we could find evidence of long necks there and missing sagittal sutures. You know, some good examples of that. That would be simply amazing to find that, hey, they had them over there too. So,
And you know,
interesting stuff.
What interests me is the work I did on Catalina Island, where we showed, and I got access to these records on Catalina Island that had gone missing for decades. And these were the records and pictures and photographs by Ralph Glidden, who was hired by the Hay Museum to do primitive archaeological digs on Catalina Island and the rest of the Channel Islands, which go from Santa Barbara down to San Diego, obviously on the west coast of the United States. And I walked in there, I was there for 10 hours, and I found 6 fingers, skeletons with 6 fingers. We found elongated skulls, 2 of them, in one picture. It looked like a mother and child, don't know. It's just a photograph, but from the photograph, it looked like a mother and child, greatly elongated skulls. And this is in Catalina Island. I mean, this is not supposed to be here, and yet it's here. We also found evidence of a 9-foot skeleton found on Catalina Island. So, you know, something is going on here. More research needs to be done.
Oh, I agree. And when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Europe, I got the chance and opportunity to visit Sardinia as a temporary duty assignment several times. Of course, this was way back in the 80s. I had no clue or idea what was on that island, and I was there driving around, and Lord knows I wish I'd known what I know now to go investigate and look at some of these structures that they have over there in Sardinia. That would have been fascinating. So I think we need to just continue with the research, especially the DNA is very important. Trying to find some more skulls that without the sagittal sutures, the posterior foramen magnum, similar type morphology over there as we see in South America. So there you start lining up the connection, because you already proved you put a boat out there in Gibraltar and it sails to South America, you know, or Central America. So
Barbados.
So or Barbados, So they ended up here. So, you know, and hate to, you know, I'm sure poor Columbus, you know, he's saying, dang, I thought I was the first one here.
The tissue fixtures seal up in the atlas after 12 years of age, and they say a range is actually 4.5 to 17 years of age. There we go, 17 again. Right. Now, the posterior portions of the tissue fusion, tissue gluing job, which is the synchondrosis, of the atlas closed after 4 years, and a range was 2 to 13. And they go on and talk about the axis and whatnot, but we still find this large span of time there. And the only thing that's happening, even with this, and you'll be able to see this when you take a look at the images, the radiology, they'll actually have pictures which will show you that what's happening is cartilage is uniting with bone. So that's it. Cartilage is uniting with bone. In all reality, it's still rather squishy. And that takes us into the reason why babies are so forgiving. They're squishy. They're really just made of cartilage for the most part.
Okay.
Now, to get into the last little bit of this, why is it that you don't want to do that? Well, let's see. Let me move this guy out of the way so I can see you, and then I can see me. Now, here's what's so interesting. I'm going to put this up here. I hope we can see this.
Yep.
We have the head here. This is the side profile of the human head.
Okay.
And what we're going to do is I'm going to reach over here and grab a pen. I'm going to sneak up in here with a pen, and there we go. So where we're going is, you see this, of course, this is your brain, that's your cerebellum, there's your brain stem. Now as we exit the skull, we're coming right out in the area of our atlas. This is our upper cervical complex, all this stuff in here. Turn around backwards, a little difficult to read. But
Okay.
you see how close everything is. It's very tight. In life, you would have a little bit more space in there.
Okay.
Because you have great juice flowing, which is called CSF. And that acts as a buffer to keep your brain buoyant and many other things. But it's still a very tight fit. So if you go and try to put pressures on there, you're going to create a lot of problems. Now, if we take a look at, let me see which one was supposed to be pulled up. Sorry, not to make too much noise. That one's really messy. This one's really cool. Well, let's take a look at this. Now, what I've done, this one is from, this is Netter, Atlas of Human Anatomy.
Okay.
And what we're going to do is put this up here.
Oh, wow.
Now what we're seeing is the top bone of your neck plus all the other gear that lives in there. Any pressure to this portion for sustained periods could compress musculature here, put pressure on the arteries,
Wow.
and, well, cause the child to pass out and then they'll die. Lack of oxygen to the brain. And there are many, many other complications that can come with messing with things in here. So we still cannot put pressure on here or there to change the skull. You
Wow.
can't do it. There's too many items.
So let me jump in here because we're down to about 8-9 minutes before we got to go. We're saying, and Rick Woodward, Dr. Alday, and yourself have stated on the record emphatically that there is no way that you can compress the skull to change the position of the foramen magnum. Not only that, in many of the Paracas skulls, the foramen ovales were absent. Not only that, but the foramen magnum shape was smaller and different than a normal human being. And then added to that, the foramen condyles apparently, according to your work and Woodward's and Alday's, more robust and much different. We got about 8 minutes. Please speak to those things in any order that you want to.
The robustness thing is something that's really got me. I'm very, very interested in several of these skulls. There's one that had very robust, thick jaws on it, and the skull as a whole was much thicker. These little pieces that come off the sides of your head, you kind of knock on those little things.
Right.
Those are balancers for some muscles that come down the sides of your neck and allow you to turn your head like so. Well, if a creature is going to have a brain hole in the back of its head, it's going to have big old knobby pieces of honking bone on its skull and a big jaw the way that guy does. It's very thick, that one of those skulls that I was looking at. I feel like he's going to have one, possibly, I'm still torn on this. I'd like to see a skeleton to truly make it a dead ringer. This is just my opinion.
Okay.
It's quite possible he could have a longer neck.
Right.
What I do see is that he will have a larger muscle mass because of the thickness of the bones. The bones are going to respond to the forces that are placed on them in that manner to make them so thick. Now, the missing foramen ovales, that's an interesting situation because you have to have them. You've got important plumbing that goes through there. So what I have seen in some of the specimens is that instead of having the foramen ovales, they have some extra, almost like small trenches in the posterior portions of the under portions of their skull. And on either the right and the left, either on both sides, bilaterally, the right and the left, you will observe small trenches, which I believe that these trenches are their substitute for not having the foramen ovale. What they've done is that they've run all their plumbing up through there. And the reason why I say that is that humans have something that's similar, not near as big. But we do have this one little thing called a foramen lacerum, and it's called that because it's the lacerated cerebellum that's lacerated. And in life, it's covered by a piece of cartilage. And that's for a nice little tube to go up and up again into the head. So it's quite possible that they, too, could have a lot of cartilage covering that hole to allow that to go in. I also see that that would be, I would say, strategically better for them to be born looking at their heads. And as you know, we talked about my theory about their whole birth process. That's why I started getting into your head. So I was thinking about how could this thing exist? Well, I have to go back to its birth process. So I believe that it was tucked in there to help it during the birth process, because if we look at the other side of the skull, we can see that this thing is designed to fold. And the front of the skull is designed to fold over the back. And that little hump right on its head, I believe, is there to give it a little extra bump coming out of the birth canal.
Interesting. So basically, is it a fair statement to say that what we are looking at here might actually be genetic and not the result of cranial deformation? Is that a fair statement?
Genetic.
Okay, so if it's genetic, and there was a piece that was on my desk, a bunch of people, my brother actually sent it to me, and I think I sent it to everybody on the team, talking about elongated skulls in Europe. They did mitochondrial DNA, but no one is looking at the morphological structures. No one has got the evidence that we have. And I actually wrote the author, the woman for Israeli News, and told her about our research. Hopefully she'll get back to me. What amazes me is we have hard evidence, and I mean it is hard evidence. Skeptics will point and say, well, you know, they'll do ad hominem attacks, but look at the data. The bottom line is no foramen ovalis in many of the skulls. The morphological differences are different. There is a lack of sagittal suture, and we all know about cranial synostosis. Dr. Alday, you know, addressed that. You've addressed it. The bottom line is there's enough morphological differences to point to genetic as opposed to cranial deformation. And if that's the case, we are into a whole, you know, we're not in Kansas anymore, basically, at that point. We're down to 4 minutes. Wrap it up for us, will you please, Doc?
Sure. Giving me the honors. Well, in a nutshell, I think that with everything that we've got, looking at the fact that the skulls are not formed the way that human skulls are, we have a lot of extra little places inside their skulls where these little things called sesamoid bones exist. And so that, coupled with the funny way that the shape that the head functions, the extremely large size of the head in comparison to the body, the odd position of the foramen magnum, and, well, the lack of some important plumbing all show that this is something. It's real. It's a something. I don't know what to call it. I don't know. It's an organism. It's a human-like organism. And we have more research to do.
A lot more research, yep. A lot more research.
It just left me stumped.
You know, it's left all of us stumped, and we're not drawing any conclusions. I mean, my personal belief is that we might be looking at the remnants of the onycheme because of the long neck feature. But that's pure conjecture on my part. And, you know, I'm just saying that my gut, that's my gut. That's what I believe. But there's no scientific data for that yet. That's why we're still on the trail. Dr. Malcolm, thanks so much for...
A little conjecture there.
There you go. Thanks so much for coming on the record. We're basically out of time, folks. If you're at all interested, we've got the book. All 8 of us contributed. Of course, Mondo Gonzalez, our archaeologist, Brian Forrester, Dr. Michael Alday, Rick Woodward, Dr. Malcolm Warren, Chase Klotzy, and our good friend Richard Shaw. It also comes with the DVD, and there's a bonus DVD that goes with it. Go to lamarzulli.net, lamarzulli.net. I'm sure you will find the press conference, which is almost 3 hours long, absolutely riveting, as all of us presented at that conference. And, of course, the book speaks for itself.